Everyone in the small Canadian town of Rimouski remembers the collapse of the Bic Bridge in 1942 as a local tragedy. A cold February morning when the steel truss gave way and plunged into the icy St. Lawrence River. But what few outside this region know is that the bridge didn't just fail. It failed 2 hours earlier than anyone predicted, and that, in a way no one could have foreseen, altered the course of the Battle of the Atlantic and possibly saved thousands of lives. To understand how a provincial infrastructure accident could echo across the Atlantic War, we have to rewind the clock, not just to that winter morning, but to the frantic, dangerous world of 1942. By then, German U-boats had pushed their hunting grounds into Canadian waters. Operation Drumbeat, the Kriegsmarine's campaign against Allied shipping, had sunk over 600,000 tons of cargo in just a few months. Convoys leaving Halifax and Sydney were under constant threat. The Royal Canadian Navy was stretched thin, escorting merchant vessels through the Gulf of St. Lawrence before they could join the larger North Atlantic convoys. On February 17, 1942, Convoy QS-15 was scheduled to leave Quebec City, making its way downriver toward the open Atlantic. Its timetable was tight. Tides, ice conditions, and coordinated rendezvous points meant delays could be deadly. The ships would be partially shielded by the still frozen stretches of the St. Lawrence, but once they reached the Gulf, they would be exposed. And German signals intelligence, the B-Dienst, was already picking up on their movements. At 5:30 a.m., the convoy was supposed to pass under the Bic Bridge, a steel cantilever structure connecting a crucial stretch of the Quebec-Levis railway line. The bridge was also vital for the Canadian National Railway, which carried military supplies including ammunition and crated aircraft parts to the ports. On the night of February 16th, engineers had been inspecting the bridge. Ice buildup and unusual vibrations had been reported by locomotive crews. The senior engineer, William J. McAllister, concluded the structure could survive until a scheduled maintenance shutdown later that morning. But at 3:28 a.m., without warning, one of the main truss sections fractured. The steel collapsed into the freezing river, taking a section of track with it. A freight train carrying munitions had been scheduled to cross at 5:45 a.m., 2 hours after the collapse. The fact that the bridge failed earlier than expected prevented that train from even approaching the span. On the surface, this seemed like a narrowly avoided domestic disaster. In reality, it set off a chain of changes in schedules, signals, and communications that would ripple far beyond Quebec. Here's how. The munitions train that was halted was meant to connect in Rimouski with a troop train carrying the 16th Canadian Infantry Brigade, which in turn was bound for Halifax to board transport ships. Those troop transports were part of the same timetable as Convoy QS-15. They were to merge into a larger convoy off Halifax on February 21st. With the bridge down, the munitions were rerouted overland via a longer, slower northern line. The troop train was delayed nearly a full day, which in turn forced Naval Command in Halifax to reshuffle departure schedules to keep escort vessels synchronized with their assigned cargo. Convoy QS-15's orders were amended in the early hours of February 17th. Instead of leaving Quebec City at 5:30 a.m., they would depart at 7 a.m. and make an unscheduled stop at Matane to wait for a different escort corvette. That 2-hour delay, the same 2 hours by which the Bic Bridge's collapse came earlier than forecast, meant the convoy entered a key stretch of the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the dark of night rather than in daylight. At that exact stretch, U-132, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Ernst Vogelsang, had been lying in wait. His orders were based on intercepted wireless traffic, predicting the convoy's arrival in daylight on February 18th. The delay threw off his timing. By the time QS-15 passed through, visibility was almost zero, and the U-boat's periscope view was reduced to dark silhouettes against ice floes. Vogelsang fired 2 torpedoes, both missing in the icy chop. The convoy slipped past, completely unaware of how close it had come to disaster. But the real twist in this story didn't emerge until after the war, when Allied and captured German records were compared. B-Dienst intercept logs revealed that the only reason U-132 was in that position was because of another piece of intelligence. The Germans had decrypted a routine Canadian railway message about the munitions train's original schedule. They assumed that the military cargo and troop transports would follow predictable timetables to the ports, timetables the collapse of the Bic Bridge completely obliterated. The irony? The Germans were victims of the same kind of clockwork predictability that had made Allied convoys vulnerable for much of the war. They had calculated an ambush based on punctuality, a random structural failure coming 2 hours earlier than feared, had erased that punctuality. And with it, their shot at crippling a convoy. The Bic Bridge itself was never rebuilt to its original form. Temporary ferry systems took over while a new alignment bypassed the old span. Locally, people remembered it as an engineering failure. Nationally, the official records chalked it up to wartime infrastructure strain. But in the chain of cause and effect, the bridge's early collapse saved lives, both on the halted munitions train and in the convoy that slipped past U-132. This isn't to romanticize the failure. 3 maintenance workers died in the collapse, and the economic hit to the region was severe. But it is to recognize that in the chaos of global conflict, sometimes a disaster in one ledger can erase a catastrophe in another. And that, in essence, is the strange double life of February 17, 1942. In one moment, a span of steel gave way, and in doing so, it broke the chain of events the enemy was counting on. The intelligence war in 1942 was a constant chess match of code-breaking, counterintelligence, and logistical prediction. German Naval Command prided itself on being able to anticipate Canadian and British convoy patterns days in advance, often using intercepted railway and port communications to triangulate schedules. What the Bic Bridge collapse did without any Allied intention was inject pure chaos into that system. Instead of neat timetables, the movements of men and materiel became unpredictable for nearly a week. Halifax convoy officers scrambled to adjust routes and schedules, rerouting smaller escorts like HMCS Shawinigan and HMCS Arrowhead to cover convoys they hadn't originally been assigned to. In the resulting confusion, 2 separate U-boat ambushes in the Gulf missed their targets entirely because the predictable shipping lanes were no longer running on the clockwork the Germans relied upon. Archival records from the Canadian Department of Transport reveal another curious ripple. A batch of aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by an RCAF Hudson bomber on February 20th was supposed to be developed and dispatched by rail to Ottawa that same day. Because of the bridge failure, the courier carrying the negatives was diverted onto a different route, where he happened to share a compartment with a signals officer from the Royal Canadian Navy's Operational Intelligence Centre. The two struck up a conversation. The courier mentioned an odd dark shape spotted in the ice near Anticosti Island, and within hours that casual remark had triggered an investigation that confirmed the presence of U-517, a German submarine that had been haunting the Gulf. The RCN was able to direct a corvette to depth charge the position, damaging U-517 enough to force it back to Lorient for repairs. In the logs of U-Boat Command, this loss of a hunter in the Gulf in February 1942 was described as operationally significant. Yet the chain of events that led to it began with a structural fatigue crack in a cold Canadian bridge. For historians, this moment is a fascinating study in what military planners call disruptive interference. Normally, disruption is intentional: sabotage, feints, misinformation. Here, the disruption was entirely accidental, yet its effect mirrored that of a well-executed deception plan. In essence, the Bic Bridge collapse performed the work of a phantom agent, altering movements, sowing confusion, and forcing the enemy to waste time and resources on fruitless intercepts. The personal stories add another layer to this web. Letters from Corporal Henry Levine of the 16th Canadian Infantry Brigade tell of the frustration his unit felt as they sat on sidings in bitter cold, waiting for rerouted trains. They cursed the bridge, unaware that their delay meant avoiding the convoy trap lying in wait downriver. In Halifax, Naval Signals Officer Lieutenant Commander Ralph Hennessy later admitted in an oral history interview that the chaos probably saved more lives than we ever knew, because the Germans couldn't hit what they couldn't find. And from the German side, post-war interrogations of Ernst Vogelsang revealed his crew had been baffled by the absence of the expected convoy, suspecting at first that they had been deliberately fed false intelligence. Ironically, that suspicion led to more cautious movements in March, reducing the aggressiveness of U-boat patrols in Canadian waters for several weeks. By early March 1942, the bridge's collapse had faded from national headlines, replaced by larger war news. A temporary trestle was being planned, the local economy was adjusting, and the military had restored its key supply lines. But the week-long disruption it caused had already played out in a dozen small ways across the theater of war. A missed ambush here, a damaged submarine there, a shipment arriving safely in Britain that might otherwise have been lying at the bottom of the Atlantic, all threaded back to that February morning when steel gave way in the pre-dawn cold. There is a temptation in history to focus only on the grand strategies, the speeches, the planned operations. But moments like the Bic Bridge collapse remind us that wars are also shaped by the stubborn realities of physics and weather, by cracks in steel, by the unglamorous mechanics of transport networks. The domino effect here was not engineered by any spy or general. It was the unintended consequence of a 2-hour difference, the gap between a planned maintenance window and an unplanned disaster. Had the bridge held until 5:45 a.m., the munitions train might have been on it when it fell, creating an explosion and loss of life that would have shaken morale across the province. Even if the train had crossed safely, the punctuality of the schedule would have delivered the convoy into the jaws of U-132. Instead, the premature collapse rewrote the script. It broke the rhythm of the war in that sector, if only for a moment. And in war, sometimes a moment is all you need. Looking back now, with access to declassified German and Canadian archives, we can draw the lines on the map and trace the signals logs to see exactly how the chain unfolded. It's a perfect illustration of the channel's mission, to show you that history isn't just the story of what was planned, but also of what broke, failed, or went sideways, and how those breaks sometimes saved the day. If you've enjoyed uncovering how an obscure Canadian bridge collapse rippled all the way to the North Atlantic Theater, then you're exactly the kind of investigator we want here on the Domino Effect. Like this video, share it with someone who thinks history is just dates and names, and subscribe so you don't miss the next time we reveal how a tiny, overlooked event bent the arc of history in a way no one saw coming.